Dr. Sun, and please welcome to the Board of Education. And we're looking forward to your presentation today.
Thank you. Good afternoon, board chair members. Holly Sun from County Budget Office. Very happy to be here. I'll try to share the screen. Hold on 1 minute. Let's try that. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Make sure I move to the middle. Try to do the full screen. It might be looking a little better. Hold on. Where is it? Okay. Can I see it, Mike?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. By the actually just to come up with a very preliminary FY22 fiscal outlook. So we'll be happy to share with the board, Dr. Maturano, and also the audience here. I will start with a little bit discussion on the capital budget, because that's actually I've been focusing on in the last few days. Frankly, there's a lot of challenges there, and then we'll move to the operating budget. Starting with the capital budget, so just take 1 minute to talk about the capital budget. How did the county finance our capital budget? There are a small portion of the capital budget are funded through designated resources there. This could be, school surcharge, transfer tax, tip bond, etc., for different purpose there. The majority of the capital or infrastructure projects throughout the county, including our education entities, are financed through issuing general obligation bonds, we call GO bonds. So, and then we pay this back, principal and interest, in the next 20 years in the county's operating budget in the debt service piece. The big concern at this point is the county's debt burden has been escalating in the last several years, measured by all critical debt indicators here. You can see that no matter debt as a percentage of assessable base, per capita debt, or debt service payment as a percentage total county budget. The last one is particularly important because our latest estimate from Finance Department just a few days ago was showing that that indicator, the debt service as a percentage of annual total county revenue or county budget, is actually already exceeded county policy ceiling at 10%. And that continues to increase in the next several years. Why that is a concern to us is because, number one, debt management or overall debt burden is one of the factors that our rating agencies look at in order to assign or maintain our AAA bond rating. The other factor is that, as we all know, in the big pie of operating budget, the more share to the debt service payment every year, or if that share continue to increase, then there's less funding available to do everything else, no matter allocation of funding to school system or support all other business in the county, holding other variables unchanged. Last but not least is that it also indicates that with those escalating debt service there, the future ability to issue new debt will be stressed, meaning that we may not be able to maintain the level of GO bond authorization we have been experiencing in the last decade. So where we are currently is that we actually find that the CIP needs really significantly exceed affordable level. The recent history in terms of GO bonds authorized in the county's annual CIP budget, as shown here, is between 75 to over 90 million. In most recent years, the number has already been coming down because the revenue growth has been slowing down. At the same time, the debt finance in the prior year started get into the debt service in the operating budget. So
are you presenting?
Yeah, because I don't see the slides corresponding to what you're saying. And I don't know if it's just me, because that could possibly be.
Yeah, it's not moving. The first
Okay,
page.
good. It's not just me, but the slides aren't moving. Sorry to interrupt.
It's not, it said the sharing is paused. I don't know
Can
why.
you want to share it again?
Maybe I'll just try one more time.
Oh, now it's moving.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
I don't know whether maybe I accidentally clicked something there. Sorry about that. So do you see the slides now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. So this slide talk about the available funding versus the requests we receive currently. I just now mentioned that in the last few years, the overall GEO authorization for new debt in the last couple of years has been dropping to 75 million last year. And the request we received so far from everybody, including education, but also county agencies, in aggregate was asking for on average 131 million a year in the next 6-year period. The difference or the gap is 42 to 62 million per year, depending on how much is the annual new debt, between 70 to 90 million. So what does that mean is that in order to close the projected gap, that means that the total request needs to be reduced by close to 50%. This is the table that was showing the annual requested total on the top. And then in the bottom is the few different scenarios on different debt authorization total. So you can tell that the gap is anywhere between 42 to 62 million, meaning that the reduction will be between 1/3 to half. And as we just talked about, the future debt capacity will likely to shrink continuously. So it's more likely, probably, my guess is probably between scenario 3 or scenario 2. So we'll likely have to make very difficult choices going forward. So at this point, the issues related to CIP is that we have some significant difference between the funding and also the needs here. So that requires really collective efforts with all the stakeholders to prioritize and decide which ones to keep, which ones, realistically speaking, has to be scaled back or delayed beyond the next 6 years, because it's not just a 1-year issue. At least in the next 6 years, we will be in that that situation. We also probably will try to explore new resources. That's probably primarily in form of seeking for federal and state funding, because no new county resource not very feasible, understanding the current economic climate. And also we know that in recent years, the county government already raised school surcharge, transfer tax, so there are not too many options. Plus, given the economic climate, it may not be the best timing to try to add burden. The other thing at the county level, but I think the school system may be having the same dilemma as how to balance, maintain the existing infrastructure and address new project needs there. Because I know like at the county level, there's a lot of roads are deteriorating, storm drainage, even the old facilities there, they all need a lot of work to maintain. But at the same time, there's a lot of community needs for different new projects there. So how to balance that? It's a big concern. And on the road, frankly speaking, in the indicator I saw to tell the condition of roads has been deteriorating multiple years in a row now. So it kind of asks for more investment in those, but hasn't been being addressed appropriately because of funding constraint. And the other thing is the cost dilemma about delaying projects. It's clearly not everything can be funded or affordable in the next 6 years. But if the ones that deemed to be priority has to be funded, then there's also an issue of if you're pushing back too much, then interest rate currently is still relatively favorable, but who knows after a couple of years, right? And also the construction costs, by talking with program manager, that has been escalating. So by delaying it in time, we also risk incurring even more costs. So that was the situation that we have to live with. Just a refreshment of the school, refresh the memory about school CIP budget. You probably know this better than me. It's the school total FY22 request to CIP is $108 million. That's including over 40 million of projected state aid and also 67.9 million for county funding. And that was captured in the first couple of rows in the table here. And for reference, under that, I was also showing what's in FY21 council approved CIP budget, where it was shown the projected affordable county funding in this period of time. In general, it's between 50 to 54 million a year. So moving to operating budget, the county's general fund are primarily consist of property tax, income tax, which represent 90% of total revenue. There are also other taxes and fees, but in general, those other combined together is relatively small portion. So historically, that's not necessarily a good factor because we're not as diversified as some other county, but interestingly, during the COVID-19, that actually protect us from seeing as big a dip, because I learned from colleagues from Montgomery County, Prince George County, etc. They have energy tax, telecommunication taxes, those was dropped very significantly during COVID-19. We do see some stress in our tax revenues, but because we don't have those to begin with, we actually didn't incur as big a hit in those fees and charges there. So property tax is our number one tax revenue or number one revenue for the general fund. The good news is that the property assessable base maintained a solid but very moderate growth in fiscal 22. Per latest State Department Assessment Taxation projection, the growth is projected to be 2.3% for the county in fiscal 22. So the reassessment in particular, because every year in Maryland, 1/3 of the property get reassessed and the value compared 3 years ago get phased in the next 3 years. So that one, the most recent area get reassessed, the phasing value is projected by state at approximately 3.1% a year in the next 3 years there. The bar chart here, some of the committee member or board member probably are very familiar with. I kind of bring it back to the board every year and just update it at New Year's information. So once upon a time, we actually, the county did very well in the property assessable base. So between 2000 and 2011, that was the time that the county experienced very high, very solid growth of property assessable base. Following that, it was a housing bubble, but after that, things has been improving, but still it's a very moderate growth. In recent years, you can tell that the actual assessment has been inching down a little bit. We're maintaining a little more than 2% growth, which is good, but it's just very normal. It's very, not normal, it's very moderate compared to the needs. There are some factors to keep in mind when we talk about property tax future or outlook. On the positive side, the county has been experiencing very strong housing market, surprisingly. So that was really good news. The bar chart on the very top was showing year-to-year transactions. You can tell that even during the COVID-19 period, with exception of a few months, most other months experienced a year-to-year increase in transactions. And also what we learned is also have been escalating, which is really good news. And we learned from the real estate association is that's triggered by the low mortgage rates and also low inventory. One thing I have to point it out, however, is because the county the inventory is really low, it does constrain future months of transaction level, but overall it was positive. There are some other things to concern, however, that is on the commercial base side. We have been heard from different sources that the commercial base might see some weakening, especially the retail mall properties, hotel, obviously, even office buildings, because some of the business are in the process of considering or transferring to more permanent work from home solutions, at least for some of their employees. So these are the part that potentially have implication on long-term assessable base. And also Maryland has so-called personal property tax. It is not really personal property, it's really business property. Now with business are under stress in COVID-19, some actually are closing down. That will have implication on business property taxes there. There's also an issue of foreclosure. It usually takes time to actually get reflected that in assessable base, but that's another thing that we have to keep an eye on. There are some uncertainty when we talk about long-term projections for property tax. One is lagged impact. In most counties and cities, municipalities throughout the United States, there's a pattern of lagging between economic changes and actual property tax base there in Maryland, because the triennial cycle that's even more so. The good news on that is if there's a negative impact, it kind of gets smoothed out and you avoid the very volatile change between year to year. The bad news is that no matter it's good or bad changes there, it gets spread out over the next several years. So even you're out of the COVID-19 assessment, you might still be seeing that reflected in the annual tax collections there. In the next few years, also starting FY22, we're starting to see the moratorium impact from the Apfo Amendment, which was an amendment to legislation on new development in the county, which is providing more, putting more restrictive school capacity tests, and that's estimated to slow down the new development. Why that matters? Because new development does actually generate different taxes, in particular on the property tax, but there are also other taxes related to that. On the long-term issue, the county are looking at very limited land left for new development. So eventually we'll get built out and we're going to see a slowdown anyway, naturally in the next decade or so. That's going to transfer a slower growth in the overall assessable base. So now switch to income tax. Income tax has been extremely wild this year. I think all the people I talked with as professional forecast kind of still try to figure out what happened there. So what to the right are two graphs I got from a state controller's office that represent both history and also forecasts in the next few years. What's on the top was the employment in the Maryland. As you can tell, there's a sharp decrease during the pandemic or at the beginning of the pandemic, followed by kind of like a checkmark shaped recovery, not totally V-shaped, but kind of through time, anticipate to go back to the normal. What's in the bottom, however, is the history and the forecast of personal income. The very funny thing is that everybody previously was anticipate what's in the bottom of the graph will largely mirror what's in the top, sometimes maybe with a lagging, but largely in that shape. But what happens during the pandemic month in Maryland, personal income tax experienced a huge bump in that period of time. So that was really totally unanticipated. Another thing to point it out is employment on the very top. You can tell that there's a few different lines that represent different consulting firms hired by the state to anticipate what's going to happen on employment growth. In general, their anticipation takes 2 to 4 years to recover to the pre-pandemic level. What's in the bottom, you can tell it's all over the place because people cannot reach consensus about what is a route to recover. In general, it was understanding or belief that after a couple of years, things go back to the normal trend. But before that, it could be all kinds of possibilities there. At the local level, income tax experienced the same pretty wild pattern. In the 3 years before the pandemic, the average income tax growth in the county, the actual growth, is 2.2% on average. In fiscal year 20, despite the pandemic, we saw a 12.8% growth. That's like 6 years total growth in 1 year. That was mostly explained by a one-time big lump sum reconciliation was lagged from several years ago when federal tax law changed, and then there was a underestimate by state about what is impactful for individual counties, and finally through taxpayers filing and delayed filing, it was reconciled to individual counties there. So that was a one-time factor. But we also found like during pandemic months, based on the data we were able to have, it was showing 4 to 5%, almost doubling the prior actual growth there. So that was just pretty interesting. And last week I was at a meeting in DC, a virtual meeting. They actually see the same thing. And pre-pandemic, DC government was seeing a personal income growth of 3.3%. During the pandemic months, that doubled to 6 to 8% growth. So what happens there through communication with different experts, we believe the biggest reason is federal stimulus, especially unemployment insurance. You might have read from the newspaper that a lot of people actually, at least on temporary basis there, even they lost a job, the check actually they brought home was actually higher than before they lost the job. But obviously that's just temporary scenario. It's also because that this pandemic impact of the economy is different. Previous recession usually hit across the board different sectors. In this round, it's really concentrated on some lower wage jobs there. So the graph to the right are the information I got from our own Economic Development Authority. The red bar represent the sectors that has a percentage of the unemployment insurance. So in other words, the one on the very top, accommodation, food, retail, hotel, these are the sectors experience the hardest hit during the pandemic. And they happen to be the one, when you look at to the right, the green bar represent average wage. They happen to be the one actually have the lowest average wage in the county. What it tells is that for individuals, really, it's really unfortunate because they're already the one kind of like struggling to make ends meet, and they are the one, unfortunately, are seeing most of the hit during the pandemic. But at the same time, when it comes to county revenues in general, they have really small impact as a group. The other thing is Maryland has a very progressive income tax structure. As a result, so the lower income folks there, relatively speaking, form a small percentage of total personal income tax in the county and also throughout Maryland. So what does that mean for FY22? All this is very murky now, right? We actually think we know something, but we really don't know for sure. So what we know is that it will likely continue to show pretty strange income tax curves there that delinked from economic fundamentals as we talk about. Typically, economy after a dip, you will see a recovery, and people are going to debate how long it takes to recover, but that's kind of like a V shape or a check mark shaped kind of recovery. But because income tax during the pandemic months, you actually collect much more than a kind of abnormally high amount. What will likely happen is when things go back to normal, you actually are seeing not as high a growth there. The other thing is lagged impact, because what happens the current year, when people do the tax filing and refund and reconciliation, it takes another couple of years to fully realize the impact on the revenues there. We already talked about employment recovery, so will likely take a couple of years. And there's also a huge uncertainty about a refund. What happens is that originally we already learned from the state controller's office, some of the unemployment insurance withholding. By the way, when people receive that checks there, it was already withhold state and local income tax. That actually will likely, a large portion will be paid back to them through the refunding process. But also, just recently, governors just announced that he wants to exempt all the unemployment insurance from withholding of both state and local income tax. That means, number one, some of the collections has already show up in the county's revenues and state revenues. We will pay it back retroactively. That could hit the end of FY21, but also fiscal year 22, and also future unemployment insurance will no longer have the withholding, which means that holding everything else the same, that will be lower than what we experienced last year. And obviously, economic recovery pace will be contingent on a lot of factors: the vaccine, pandemic, federal stimulus, any other policy change will have impact. The overall job market have been improving, so the unemployment rate in the county has been dropping from the peak time during the pandemic, but still obviously still much above the pre-pandemic level. The county has a contracted consulting firm at the University of Baltimore, and they were anticipating that last fiscal year, last calendar year, this is our calendar year 2020, despite economy, personal income in the county will likely see a huge spike, but then it's likely be followed by a weakening to probably around 0.6 to 1.2% growth in calendar year 2021, and maybe take a couple of years to go back to like the historical level. So what does that mean to the overall revenue projections? Our preliminary projections at this point are looking at year-to-year revenue growth of 26.7 million, or about 2.3%. So we talk about property tax, it's close to 2%. Income tax, we're tentatively putting 6.6% because the first quarter of this year was so good. On the other hand, as we just talked about, there's still a lot of uncertainty down the road, but in knowledge of the good performance so far, so we're putting a kind of positive projection for now. Other local taxes, we see a recovery, at least a partial recovery. It was really mixed bag. Some of them, like a local hotel tax, that actually was year-to-date down, not year-to-date, throughout the pandemic, they're like 60% lower than normal. So we actually over budgeted that in FY22. This one actually underperformed. The same thing for admission amusement tax. I think that was down by 80%. But some other ones actually either are not hit as hard or was hit hard at the beginning, but now started to come back a little bit. So I think we're seeing some recovery in FY22. State share tax, that's just kind of a very small amount to begin with, then just kind of keep the year-to-date information based on year-to-date. Charge for service permits there, moderate growth. Again, there's different changes there. We house federal prisoners there. So ICE, because of policy change, that revenue dropped by more than $2 million in this year and going forward. So that's offset by some of the recovery in charges and permits. Recovery investment, that was just very minor change. Other financing transfer, there are a couple of things going on. Some are just technical adjustment because council moved some funding from Housing Renew Fund to this fund, and then that's the temporary thing, and we're going to move it back in next year. So that's a technical adjustment. But also we use some transfer from other funds to help bridge the gap in FY21. That's a one-time deal. The prior funds is 7.5 million. What happens is by county charter, the county can only use fund balance for one-time non-recurring type of expenditure, with exception of emergency like natural disaster, etc. And last year, the county council voted to use that 7.5 million reserve for recurring expenditure because of the nature of the pandemic. By the way, that requires more than 4 council votes in an attempt to mitigate impact to the counties. And that was a one-time deal. So once you take that out, total revenue growth is projected to be 2.3%. One thing we just talked about is in FY22, we had to deal with not only the normal issue, but also some of the previous decision in the last budget. In the current approved budget, as we just mentioned, there are some one-time solutions. So for example, there's about 11.5 million, as we just mentioned, one-time funding used to cover ongoing recurring expenditures. There's also some non-sustainable reductions. For example, snow removal was cut, funding to risk management was cut, and we also freeze almost all civilian vacancies across county agency there. So those are non-sustainable, meaning that you cannot keep that level in the following year. In fact, snow removal, we might already blow the budget by this time from the weather forecast. That probably will be very true. So these one-time measures, the good thing is does help avoid FY21 budget to show a very deep cut to services or hit our employees there. But what it does is buy time, but push some of the burdens to FY22. It's going to make 22 more difficult than normal. So what does that mean to the expenditure side? So the revenue growth was projected at 26.7 million. The funding requests we collected so far preliminary from all the entities and county agencies add up to 62.7. So that's about a gap of $36 million. There's a couple of things to point out. One is the education entity, their request together is almost close to 100% of revenue growth alone. And also there are a couple of items of expenditure increase are non-discretionary by nature. Once debt service is once you issue debt, you have to pay principal interest. And so that's estimated 3.9 million growth in FY20. That's actually on the low end in the past few years. In one of the years, we actually have 10 million increase a year. The reason that it's not as big is because interest interest rate is relatively low currently, and also we are in the process of doing some refinancing, so that helps prevent the number from a bigger increase. We also were going to pay the first year payment of P3 annual service payment. That's for the new courthouse to replace, I think, more than 180-year-old existing courthouse. So the project cost is kind of comparable to high school, but through a P3, it's award-winning, by the way, P3 contract there. It's going to cover, it is 30-year contract that's going to kick in the next fiscal year, and we need to start to make the payment to count that service as well as the operating maintenance. And of course, the other agencies have their requests. Part of that is to cover normal costs, and part is just to at least restore a portion of the cut last year. School operating budget request, again, you're probably more familiar than me on that. The total budget growth based on superintendent budget proposal is 1.5%. Assuming a flat state aid and adjustment other resources there, the superintendent's budget was making a request or projection of 22.1 million increase in county funding. And that's the amount we show in the prior table. That's about 3.6%. And just for clarification, the maintenance effort of a state mandated formula-driven growth of county funding based on enrollment data, because enrollment actually had been dropping by 2.8%, would otherwise be 7.5 million drop for the maintenance effort requirement, the county funding change. For the operating budget, there's also some issues there. One is that just talking about a county agency, which I am more familiar with there, we really have no low-hanging fruits there, because the last several years we have been tapping that ask agency saving options every year, and every year I took some of that. So agency are already kind of bare bone. Also, there are still in hiring freeze currently, so we haven't lifted that policy yet, given the uncertainty of the economy and the policies there. So agents are really struggling just to cope with the service needs with less staff or resources currently. So some of the agents I know are in the front line, like the health department of community resources, housing, economic development, they're actually dealing with more service rather than less service, but we cannot allow them to fill all the vacancies for now because we don't have the funding in the FY21 approved budget. So going forward, that's already building the base, by the way. So going forward, how to generate additional savings on top of that is kind of a big question. And revenue options always is not very feasible in current economic climate. So any further reduction, truly, I was worried that it could risk some direct impact on either people or services there. It also makes very clear that any one-time short-term solutions, it will provide some temporary relief, but it's going to have a significant impact on the following year by creating some structured deficit, as we kind of just talked about that. A couple of clarification FY20 surplus. People probably already heard about in FY20, the county closed the year with a surprisingly high surplus there. As we just talked about, is primarily attributable to the one-time delay of reconciliation of federal tax law change a couple of years ago on income tax. So that's really one-time factor, not an ongoing stream of revenues. But also keep in mind that at the beginning of pandemic, the county was very quick in slowing down expenditure. We asked everybody tighten their belt. We implement hiring freeze right away. We delayed or scaled back procurement. As a result, that also contributed to the savings in FY20. As we talked earlier, the per county charter, these surplus can only be used for one-time type of expenditure, not the repeatable type of expenditure. We also have to replenish the use of policy reserve that was depleted in developing FY21 budget to close the gap at that point in order to maintain our AAA rating and also enhance the capacity in this time of uncertainties there. We also are going to have a lot of continued needs on pandemic relief programs. The federal COVID-19 CARES Act funding provide a lot of help, but that's run out by end of December last year. And the needs continue in the community. So recently the council just approved the use of 6.5 million of surplus to provide relief, food, utilities, assistance to small business there, that type of, and housing. So that's mortgage prevention, default prevention, that kind of program there. And that needs is not going away. So we're thinking that the rest of calendar year and beyond, there will be some additional needs. Last but not least, we just talk about very significant gap on the CIP side. If valid, we might think of this be a source of the funding to provide at least a piece of the help there to support some high priority projects. So in the multi-year projection, we also update our multi-year projections here. The expenditure forecasts are from all the entities there, including our education entities and all county agencies there. And based on even a kind of maintenance level, not a lot of new efforts, expenditure growth was in generally projected at between 3.1 to 3.9, average kind of like 3.4, 3.5% a year. It's really kind of, a very reasonable type of expenditure growth. The problem is the revenue growth in this period of time was projected to be averaging about 2.5%. So still not keeping up with even a reasonable expenditure growth projection. So we'll likely have a gap like what we just talked about for FY22 for future years as well. So if we any corrective action, then that gap is going to increase every year over time. In terms of long-term projection, there are different factors impacting that, and we already economic recovery pace that will absolutely be a determining factor. The federal state policy that's directly linked to all this. The lagging impact between economy and revenue that also plays a role. Actually, historically, I went back to the last couple of recessions the county experience. It usually takes 2 to 3 years to fully feel the impact. So this year, I don't know yet, but I think there should be some lag impact as well. We already talked about the Apfo impact amendment, Apfo amendment impact. There will also be underlying changes here in these community that's going to shape the future year's fiscal outlook. One is the demographic trends there. So the county's population growth used to be very high. The last decade, it slowed down to about 1.5% a year. Current forecast is next few decades is going to slow down further. And the most recent projection I saw from a planning and zoning department is about 0.6% per year in the next 2 decades on average. But the county is also seeing a rapidly aging of our population. So I think 10 years ago, 55 plus population is a little bit over 20%. In the next 20 years, I think that's projected to be more than 30%. So that's going to be a big transition of our community, and that's going to have implication on both revenue and service needs. Then development, as we are going to build out, that's going to have implication on future revenues. So I'll stop there, and any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sun. And I think the board and the public community really appreciate your presentation. And I really hope we have another hour to talk about this, but unfortunately we have another meeting lined up. And I hope board members, you have questions, try to reach out to their office and our own office and get more understanding. And so the board next work session, do you have anything you want to wrap up or you want to?
Oh, not really. But also, as Dr. Wu said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or email me. I'll do best to get back to you. All right. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sun.